Today we're going to be discussing what economists do, and largely that's observing and explaining what's happening in the economy. And I'd like to do that with an example. There's millions of examples one could look at, but I think this one is particularly instructive and interesting, and it has to do with income distribution. As many people have talked about and know about, the income distribution in the United States, actually in some other countries as well, but the focus has been on the United States, has grown somewhat less equal in recent years. Richer have earned a larger fraction of the income than people that are not so rich. And there's a great debate about why this is happening and what the role of government, if any, should be in this issue. So let's actually look at some data and think about economic theory, so data and theory, to see if we can get some handle on this issue. So I want to look at some data over time, and I'll consider some of the economic theories. Now, the first step in looking at data is to try to interpret. Now, usually it's pretty complicated. So I've just listed here a lot of data going back to the late 1940s in the United States, and it shows the real income of people in the top 10% and in the bottom 90% of the income distribution. So it's the average of what the people in the top 10% are getting in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation, and you can see how it's generally tended to increase over time, both for the top 10 and the 90. And so changes in the income distribution would be affected by more rapid growth of income in the top and maybe less rapid growth in income for those at the bottom. And that's what these data show you. Now, as so often in economics, interpreting the columns of figures like this is kind of mind-boggling. It's hard for economists, hard for anybody to interpret such a large number of data. And this is just an example. Sometimes it's much more than that. So economists usually try to plot the data carefully and try to look at it. So let's plot this data that's on the screen. And here's a plot. So what I've taken is taken up the years on the horizontal axis back to the late 40s up until 2012, and on the vertical axis I'm putting the average income in dollars of the people in the top 10% and in the 90%. So you can see some things here, but in a way this is not a very good chart because you can't see much that's going on in the 90%. They're basically squinched down at the bottom. And so economists will try to find better ways to represent the data so that we could at least figure out what's going on. And a lot of times the challenges in economics, elementary economics, is how to represent the data in a way that you can begin to interpret it and make some sense of it. And this isn't really quite ready. But what you could do is look at the percentage change in income for both the 90% and the top 10%, because percentage changes adjust for the fact that the levels may be quite different, as in this picture. So let's look at the percentage change in income for the 90% and the percentage change in income for the top 10% over this same span of time. And when you do that, you get this picture. So this becomes something a little more sensible, something you could interpret. And if you look at it carefully, it's looking at how much income has grown in percentage terms since 1948, the late 40s, for both the 90%, that's the blue, and the top 10%, that's the red. So now it's kind of comparable. It's percentage changes. And if the percentage change in income growth is about the same for both, then the distribution of income is not changing because the incomes at the top are growing about the same rate as the incomes at the bottom, and you're not changing the income distribution. If one goes faster than the other, you're changing the income distribution. So now you have a chance to really try to interpret what's going on. So that change of the representation to percentages rather than the absolute values helps in doing that. Now, if you look carefully, there's different trends in this period of time. So for example, from the late 40s until sometime in the mid 60s, you had both groups growing at about the same rate. So the income distribution didn't change much. The upper 10% was growing about the same as the other 90%. And so they're both about the same, therefore the relative performance has not been much different. So the income distribution didn't change. And then you had this period from the mid-60s through the 70s where everybody's income growth slowed down tremendously, so there weren't very many gains at all. Of course, the income distribution didn't change then at all either because both income groups, their growth rate diminished substantially. So something was going on during that period in the late 60s and 70s. I think of it, and we'll talk about more later in this course, that had to do with economic policy that held both groups back. And then you continue in time, you see something really, really remarkable happen, because somewhere in the late 70s, 80s, growth started to increase actually for both groups, but much more for the top 10%. And that's where that's the period when the income distribution spread, when people began to think about, well, this is a situation where the rich are getting richer and the poor aren't, at least not much more. And then we look at the final period, which is just the last few years, and lo and behold, you see both groups are not doing so well, but maybe in some sense, especially the lower 90%. And so this is something that's going on in history that you could want to try to explain. As I mentioned, I think the late 60s and the 70s has to do with economic policy that wasn't quite up to par. I think the more recent period, economic policy wasn't up to par, but we're going to talk about that and see different viewpoints. What happened in the 80s and 90s? And I think here what an economic model would suggest, the kind of economic models we'll be covering in this course, would suggest looking at the reasons, trying the reasons why growth of income was different for some groups. And you can see some of that reason by looking at the gains to getting more education. So maybe the people in the top 10% had more education and their returns to their education was moving more. Well, let's see if that's a possibility. And indeed, when you look at it, you begin to see it really is. So this chart, a very important chart for economics, because it tells you the relative returns, the relative increase in your wage, if you go to college, as distinct from high school, or if you go to graduate school, as distinct from high school. And so, for example, where it says 1.5, that's a 50% higher wage for a college graduate than for a high school graduate. When it says 1.7, it's a 70% rise. If it's 2, it's 200%, doubling the amount. And so what you can see here is the returns, the benefits to going to college or even graduate school, higher education, however you define it, increased tremendously in the 1980s and 90s. And so that's a possible explanation. I think a good part of the explanation for the widening of the distribution, the fact that those at the top gain more than those in the 90%. And so that's a possible explanation. It's an economic theory behind that. The more your skills are, the higher your wage. It fits the data, and it's a model that explains the data. There will be debates about this. Indeed, there are debates about this, considering other explanations. But this is indeed an example of looking at the data, getting the data in a form you can interpret it, and then giving a particular interpretation. And that's a lot about what economists do, about what economics is all about. Now, when you do all this, you realize that there's some important issues about doing economics and using the data in theory in this way. One is this distinction between positive economics and normative economics. By definition, positive economics mean explaining why something occurred, just like we did in the last few minutes. We tried to explain why the income distribution spread in the 80s and 90s until recently. That's a positive explanation, positive economics being used. There's also normative economics. Normative economics is where you're giving recommendations about what policy should be. So for example, here, if we think it has to do with the education system and we'd like to have a more equal distribution of income, then it suggests looking at the education system and, in fact, trying to find out why there aren't more people going to college or fewer people dropping out of high school, making recommendations about education reform. That's the normative part of economics. You're making policy recommendations. There's actually a part of positive economics which is related to policy, and that is you try to use economic theory to explain why policy decisions get made. So if you don't like the education system, you try to explain why we have the one we do. Even if you have recommendations, you might want to understand why we are where we are, and that frequently involves positive economics to explain why those policy decisions were made using the regular tools of economics. These examples also show that there's a real issue of how partisan economics should become. Some groups might want to argue that it's not education or it's something else. And so it becomes part of partisan politics or adversarial. There's adversarial issues all throughout in courts. There's people take one side or another, and economists are frequently asked to testify in one side or another. So in principle, economics becomes partisan or nonpartisan depending on the setting. In a course like this, of course, we want to emphasize the nonpartisan aspects the best we can, looking at the data, looking at the theory, and trying to give the right answer. And then finally, these examples, I think, illustrate this important question that people raise is, why do you economists disagree so much? At least that's what we seem to think when we look at the talking heads on TV and other things like that. Well, one thing to keep in mind is a lot of that disagreement has to do with the more macroeconomic side of things, what the Fed should do or what tax policy should be, rather than the micro side. In fact, on the micro side, there's much less disagreement. And another reason for disagreement is, unlike physics or some of the hard sciences, you really can't do experiments very much in economics. We're trying to do more of that, but you can't really have a completely different policy in the 1980s and 1990s because they've already transpired. You can't rerun those years. You can't really do an experiment with a different educational system then. So it's easy to disagree for that reason. And finally, let's face it, economists are just like anybody else. They have their motivations, they have their views, and that will affect their positions and their research to some extent. Try not to do it, try to avoid it, but let's face it, that's reality. So thank you, and I look forward to the next discussion.